Creeping through the woods that night, I was caught off guard by a sharp pain in my right leg that almost made me drop my bat. If only I hadn't sustained that grievous wound last night, the task at hand would be much easier. Nevertheless, I will continue, for no one else can do this but me. I braced myself against a tree and thought back to how this had started. In hindsight, I should have been more concerned, but that's in the past now. It was a night like any other. The moon was out full and bright, the stars were shining just around the edges of it, and I was sitting at home in my hammock, staring up at them, daydreaming about life. I must have dozed off at some point. The next time I was aware of the time, it was daybreak. It felt like no time had passed, but I was prone to pass out without notice due to my insomnia, and was used to that feeling. I went to stand up, but as I swung my legs around under me, something caught my eye. In the corner of my yard, closest to the driveway, was a jet-black dodecahedron. It appeared to be as smooth as glass and as dark as a void. I stared for a moment, transfixed at the strange sight. It couldn't have been more than a foot in diameter and height. I decided to investigate, so I continued my action to stand and slowly walked across the yard toward the bizarre object. As I approached, the temperature rose at least 20 degrees. Looking at the surface of the polygonal object, its sides weren't as smooth as they appeared from my hammock. Its surface was rough, like waves, and behind its void-like color was a sort of static. It was mesmerizing, and I swear I could see shapes in it. I stood there, staring at it for a good 10 minutes, until my wife came out to see where I had been. I jumped when she touched my arm, breaking me of my trance. When she inquired as to where I had been all night and what the black object was, I told her of my night and how I only just noticed the thing after waking up. She expressed joy at my being able to sleep for the first time in 2 nights, but concern at the location I chose to do so, and at the unusual guests in our yard. We elected to call a friend who was a professor of archaeology, who happened to be in town for a new museum exhibit, to see if he had seen anything like it. So we left it alone and went inside to call him. It took 2 hours for him to arrive. Evidently, there had been some fiasco at the exhibit, and that was the earliest he could come. When he arrived, I escorted him to our backyard, while my wife stayed inside. We had lost the cat last night, and she was convinced he was in the house. As we approached the dodecahedron, I was stopped in my tracks, because I noticed it was at least 4 inches larger. My friend inquired why I stopped, and I informed him that it was larger than it was previously. Curiosity piqued, he moved to study it. Several minutes passed. As they did, I noticed how fascinated he was with it. He asked occasional questions, sometimes to me, sometimes to no one in particular. He seemed like he was all right, so I excused myself to join my wife in the search for our cat. Some time passed, and after ineffectively helping the search, I went back outside to see how my friend was doing in his study. Exiting the house, I looked over to where he was when I left him. But not only was he not there, but neither was the thing. My heart rate elevated as I scanned the immediate area for either of them. I was starting to panic and was about to run inside. But then, I just barely saw his head on the edge of my property. Relieved, I ran over to see what he was doing and where the thing had gone. I called him, but he didn't turn. His head was down, like he was looking at the floor. As I got closer, I didn't see anything he could be looking at. When I reached him, I held out my arm to touch his shoulder, to try and get his attention. However, before I touched him, he grabbed my hand and turned around to face me. He looked awful. His hair was matted, wet and unkempt. The veins in his face were all visible and pulsing, and his eyes were blood red, like he had popped several blood vessels in both. It was then that I noticed he was holding it, the dodecahedron. He stared at me for a moment, then let go of my hand and spoke in a voice so low I could feel it in my bones.
"This one you knew is gone. I am using his form to move my child to a more suitable hatching location.
He fondled the black polygon.
You were lucky to bear witness without succumbing to its effects. Leave now and tell no one, or else I will wreak vengeance upon you.
I shuddered as each word vibrated my very soul. I struggled to form a sentence, but asked what this being wanted. Anger creeped over its face, and his voice crashed through me again.
What my goal is beyond your comprehension. It shall start with complete subjugation of your world.
I wasn't left with many options there. I could be a hero and try to stop this whatever, or I could leave like it wanted. Well, there was the third option of grovel and hope it took pity on me when the time came. Then a thought rang out in my head, and I asked if it knew what happened to my cat. I didn't know if it was really worth the planet, but I had to ask.
Sooner or later, all animals shall be sustenance for me and my children.
That was enough for me. I wanted to cower, but that cat meant a lot to my wife and I, and before I could stop myself, I had thrown a punch square at the jam of what had been my friend. As he reeled back, in what I was hoping was more pain than shock, the dodecahedron fell to the ground with a thud, and I lunged forward to grab it. My hand grazed aside, and I heard a wet noise behind me, followed with immediate pain beyond words. Fully distracted from the task I had previously been so focused on, I looked back. The forearm of my former friend was gone, save for his veins, which were currently digging into my leg and clawing deep. I shrieked in pain and swatted at the bloody tendrils fastened to me. It released me and I rolled over and held my leg, trying to stop the bleeding. I peered over in my daze to see the creature pick up what I'm sure now was its egg, with its vein tendrils, and howl in a pitch so intense it forced the air from my lungs.
Don't follow me. This is your last warning, worthless meat.
Then it ran off to the woods at the edge of the property and disappeared. It was at this point I noticed it was night, because I lost sight of him in the darkness. Evidently the sun had gone down at some point during our scuffle. I managed to take my shirt off and tourniquet my leg well enough to limp back to the house. My wife, oblivious to anything that had gone on, was utterly hysterical at the sight of me. I tried to explain what happened, but I could hardly get a word in. Eventually, I lied and told her a mountain lion came out of the woods and clawed me when I tried to shoo it away. She seemed content with that and insisted that we go to the hospital. I kept saying I wasn't going to go, I needed to stay here. Eventually, we compromised, that she would call the doctor and have him come here. After she was done, I was forced to eat something. I tried to tell her that I had to go, but she wasn't having it. She insisted whatever I had to do, it should wait till after the doctor arrived tomorrow morning. I gave up trying to convince her after 20 minutes and opted to think through where the thing that was once my friend would go in those woods. I hobbled over to my study and dug out a map of the area. Peering over it, I couldn't really make out anywhere that would make a suitable hatching place for whatever was about to subjugate our world. The words rung through my ears, remembering the voice that had spoken them. I shuddered, and my wife appeared with a cup of tea. She asked what I was doing, and looked over the map as I took a sip. I lied and said I was wondering if there was a hiking spot with a good view of the wildlife out there. She looked up thoughtfully and said she couldn't think of anything too spectacular. Then with a start, she exclaimed that I had forgotten about taking her to the hot spring in the woods. I waved it off and told her I hadn't forgotten, I was just waiting for our anniversary. Then I paused for a moment in thought. Then all at once I exploded with an epiphany. The hot spring would be a perfect place to hatch an egg. Now I knew where he would be going. I just had to get away and deal with this mess. My wife seemed confused, but kind, and after I had calmed down, I explained that I would take her as soon as my wound healed enough to permit it. She seemed satisfied with that, and I informed her that it was late and she should get some rest. She objected, but I told her I'd be fine. I slept last night anyway, so it'd be a while before I could again. Besides, all I do is reread some books I had meant to. After some coaxing, I went up with her and saw her to bed, and when I was completely sure she was out, I made for the door. I needed a weapon, and I searched around and found my old bat leaning against the porch. I swung it a few times to check the weight and reeled from the pain in my leg. I steadied myself and turned towards the forest. I looked up at the window to my bedroom where my wife was sleeping. I considered staying, but the word subjugate again rang through my head. I shook it off and limped my way toward my fate. I steadied myself on my tree and looked up at the sky. It was turning a blue hue, so it must have been morning. Progress through the woods was slowed at this point, due to my leg, but I was confident that I was close to the hot springs. I moved to stand and heard a horrible crunching sound just ahead. Maybe 200 feet. Well, at least I knew I was heading the right way. I finished standing and carefully moved toward the location the sound had come from. I reached a thick bush and slowly moved the branches aside to peer through to what lay beyond. Not to my surprise, it was the hot spring just as I remembered it, with its 3 pools and small overhang on the far side. Although last time there wasn't an abundance of blood. I scanned the pools for any sign of the creature and spotted him by the pool partially under the overhang at the far side. I wasn't sure at first because a lot more of it was missing. Only the left leg, right arm, upper third of the torso, and half its face were left. Everything that was still there was connected with veins, hanging and slithering, dripping with fresh blood. I made an effort to conceal my breathing and moved into the clearing to see if I could spy the egg. The being was busy messing with the corpse of a deer, which I assumed was the source of the sound. I reached the first pool of the 3 and strained my vision to the pool it was standing near. There at the bottom I made out the familiar shape of the egg, its void-like color a stark contrast to the blue of the water. At this point I didn't really have a plan beyond smashing the thing and bashing the creature over the head till it stopped moving, so I tried to think of a good strategy as I moved to get closer, but pain shot up my leg and caused me to stumble. For a split second I wondered if I was heard. That question was answered with a deer carcass being hurled at me. I ducked and it nearly missed my head. I looked up directly into what had been my friend's eyes. They were turning dark due to the blood in them, and they didn't look like they were working all too well anymore. The creature gurgled and shrieked in a tone that rattled my teeth. Then in that familiar deep tone, it spoke.
"You fool! I warned you to stay away. Now I will ensure a slow, painful death at my hands, and you will rot here, unknown and worthless."
It lunged at me, tendrils wriggling in the air. I took a breath and brought the bat in an upward swing which landed under what was left of its chin. It squealed in pain, veins writhing, and fell backward into the middle pool. I moved as fast as my leg would let me toward the egg. When I reached the pool, I heard splashing behind me and knew my time was short. I wound back for the attack, but my bat was stopped on the backswing. I turned my head and the monster was holding it in place with its remaining arm. I pulled at the bat to free it, but with no luck, and its tendril arm wrapped around my throat. I struggled to breathe as it dug into my skin, and the beast laughed in its deep, horrible tone.
"Did you think you could stop me? I've conquered dozens of worlds, and no puny creature such as you will stop me."
I was beginning to black out, and had to do something. I let go of the bat, reached up to its face, and gouged my thumb into its eyes. He stumbled back in agony, releasing my throat. This was my chance. I grabbed the bat with a mighty swing and brought it down on the egg in the pool. It burst with such force that I was thrown back into the rock wall nearby. A wave of what looked like static came towards me, and for a moment my vision was filled with it. I rubbed my eyes, and as they cleared I could see a shadow of some sort leave me and go up into the sky. It reminded me of smoke, constantly moving, but jet black like a hole in reality. I blinked, baffled at the sight, and turned to look at where the creature was, and there too I saw a shadow-like presence surrounding it. It continued to writhe in pain, then stopped suddenly and with its empty sockets stared into my eyes and dissolved into nothing. All that was left was the shadow, and from it emanated that all-too-familiar tone that chilled me to my core.
You may have stopped me for now, but I have more children, and I will come for you. Mark my words, worthless creature.
And in the blink of an eye, it vanished. All was quiet, and I relished my triumph of the danger to our planet for as long as my body would allow, because at that moment I passed out from blood loss. I was awakened by my wife at what appeared to be midday, given the light. She harshly scolded me, and only found me due to my interest in the hot spring last night. She finished by saying I should have at least waited for the doctor. She commented on the fact that I looked worse, and I told her I would explain everything when we got home, but she should know that I dealt with the creature who killed the cat. She looked at me puzzled for a moment, and asked what I meant. I repeated what I had said. Then she informed me that she had found the cat this morning under the wardrobe in the attic when she checked it for me. I paused for a moment and began to chuckle, although the pain kept me from laughing too hard. Oh well, at least I saved the Earth, I thought. She helped me up and we headed home, under the light of a new day. Happy, in pain, but mildly content that despite the threat I could probably handle it if that thing decided to come back. Maybe.